Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're getting into something pretty fascinating, the financial roller coaster that professional gamers can find themselves on.
Yeah, it's a wild ride. We looked at some material you send over clips from a podcast called Game Over, when pro gamers hit rock bottom.
Right, game over. And it really highlights these incredible highs, huge earnings, but then sometimes a really steep drop.
Exactly. So our mission here is to unpack that journey. We want to understand the financial ups and downs, what leads to them, and, what lessons pop out.
Okay, let's jump in. The source material kicks off with the glory days, which makes sense. It's the dream scenario.
Totally. You got these often really young people, sometimes literal teenagers, hitting it big.
Yeah, winning massive tournaments, getting recognized, autographs. The podcast even mentioned someone buying a Lamborghini almost straight away. Crazy stuff.
And the money isn't just from winning prizes, though that's obviously huge. It's sponsorships, it's streaming revenue, brand deals. It all stacks up.
They gave that example, didn't they? A top streamer making, what was it, $10 million a year?
Yeah, something like $10 million annually just from subscribers and selling merchandise. That's peak potential right there.
Wow. Okay, so it sounds amazing. They're living the dream. How does it go wrong? It seems hard to fumble that kind of income.
Well, that's where the podcast pivots to the downfall. And a huge factor seems to be maybe a surprising lack of financial planning.
Okay. So great at game strategy, maybe not so much at money strategy.
Kind of, yeah. Especially considering how young many are when they start earning big. You're maybe 18, 19, suddenly handling sums you never imagined.
Yeah,
Long-term planning might not be the first thing on your mind.
that makes sense. And the podcast had examples of where the money went,
Yeah.
right? Not just the fun stuff like cars and parties.
Right. There was the luxury spending, definitely, but also riskier ventures. They mentioned crypto schemes being pushed, sometimes just through DMs on platforms like Discord.
Oh, wow. So not exactly sound financial advice channels.
Probably not. And there was that specific anecdote, remember, about someone spending $500,000 building up a collection of CSGO skins.
Yeah. $500,000 on virtual items.
And then the market for them just tanks. It really shows the volatility, the risk involved in some of these newer digital asset spaces.
Yeah.
Maybe not fully grasped.
So it's spending, it's risky investments.
Yeah.
What else? The podcast mentioned career length.
Oh, absolutely. That's a massive factor. The career span in esports is, well, notoriously short. Most players are retiring by their mid-20s.
25. That's incredibly young compared to traditional sports.
Exactly. You have a much shorter window to make your peak earnings. So if you haven't planned for what comes after, and retirement planning often isn't happening, you hit a wall pretty fast.
And then the simple stuff like taxes can trip people up too.
Huge consequences. They mentioned one gamer owing something like $2 million in back taxes.
$2 million just because they didn't save for it.
Apparently.
Yeah.
It just underscores how crucial getting proper advice is, especially with income from, all sorts of places, winning, streaming, deals. It gets complicated.
Yeah, you definitely need a pro for that. So the podcast then used some case studies to make this more concrete. They mentioned Ninja's success, but focused on the struggles.
Right. And what stood out was the instability. They had this example, Player X, who buys an $8 million mansion.
$8 million?
Yeah, based on this big team contract. But then the team drops him, the income disappears, and suddenly that mansion is a huge liability. It shows how insecure even big contracts can be.
That's rough. And there was the mention of Tifu's lawsuit, too. He called his contract modern-day slavery, I think.
He did. And that touches on another potential issue, maybe exploitative contracts, especially for young players who are just eager to get signed and might not, have the best representation or understanding.
So power imbalances between the players and the orgs.
Potentially, yeah. It raises questions about whether the structures are always fair, especially when you're dealing with very young, very talented individuals.
And then the whole crypto collapse part. That was quite something.
Oh, yeah. Pro gamers promoting NFTs, hyping them up.
And then the value drops to, what was the phrase? Minecraft dirt block levels.
Laugh slightly, yeah, something like that. It's funny, but also a pretty stark warning about, maybe not taking investment advice from people whose main skill is gaming, not finance. And just generally being skeptical of online hype.
Definitely a cautionary tale. But it wasn't all doom and gloom, was it? The podcast talked about the comeback.
Thankfully, yes. It explored how former pros can recover or pivot, and many do. The skills they build, the audience they have, that's valuable.
So what kind of paths did they mention?
Things like coaching upcoming players,
Mhm.
focusing full-time on content creation, streaming, videos, etc. And some even become like finance influencers within the gaming space.
Interesting. And they highlighted Disguised Toast, right, as someone who managed it well.
Exactly. He diversified, big into streaming, but also made investments in tech startups. It shows the power of not having all your eggs in one basket.
So diversification is key. What other advice came out of that section?
Pretty practical stuff, actually. The need for financial literacy, just learning the basics. Hiring a professional like a CPA to handle the complexities.
Right, the tax thing again.
Definitely. And being really careful about spending on things that lose value fast, like fancy cars, unless you can genuinely easily afford them.
And maybe avoid the diamond-encrusted controllers.
Chuckles.
Yeah.
Probably a good idea, yes.
Yeah,
That was their memorable example of just unnecessary extravagance that eats away at your savings.
makes sense. Okay, and finally, they had that listener Q&A a bit. The question about the #1 mistake young gamers make really stuck out,
Yeah, and the answer was basically living like the peak earnings will last forever.
which they almost certainly won't, given the short careers and how fast games change.
Precisely. So the takeaway was you need to save aggressively and invest wisely during those high-income years. Recognize that fame, especially online fame, can be fleeting. Plan for the long haul.
They also briefly mentioned burnout, which isn't strictly financial, but you can see the link.
Oh, for sure. If you burn out, you can't compete, you might lose deals, maybe even have health costs.
Yeah.
It absolutely impacts your finances indirectly. Looking after yourself is part of financial planning in a way.
Good point. So, wrapping this deep dive up, the big takeaway seems unavoidable. Managing money well isn't optional for pro gamers. It's absolutely essential.
Couldn't agree more. Given the volatility, the short careers, it has to be a core focus.
But listening to all this, it feels like these lessons aren't just for gamers, are they?
Not at all. I think that's the really interesting part. Seeing how even people earning huge amounts in a fast-moving field can be vulnerable,
Yeah.
well, it makes you think.
So, maybe the final thought for our listeners is this. Considering what we've heard about the financial ups and downs in esports, what broader lessons can we take away from managing our own money and careers, especially if we're in fields that change quickly?
Yeah, that's a really good question to ponder. What applies to managing finances and building longevity, no matter the industry? Definitely some food for thought there.